Okay, my name is Jean Foley Doyle. I grew up for the first 10 years of my life next to the Emma Andrews Library on Purchase Street. It was a great place to live. Unfortunately, sometimes it has a bad reputation because people think it was a very dangerous place to live. On the other hand, if you'd listen to all the females who lived down there, you'd find out it was a very nice place to live. The neighbors were wonderful, and there was a lot to do at that time. What I remember most about it is the fact that children were much freer than they are today. Parents weren't constantly looking out to see where you were. You went outdoors to play and they expected you to come in when you were supposed to come in. So what would seem abnormal to a person today would be when I was 5 years old. My friends mostly were a year ahead of me, and they were off to the Brown School. I was kind of alone, so I would think nothing of walking up around the corner down Madison Street, across the street, and playing the boats there at the landing. No one would even think of allowing their children to do that at 5 years of age today. But that's the way it was. They didn't expect you to do that. And I can remember very well Joe Hale. Now, Joe Hale today is remembered as a great philanthropist. And as an adult, I understand that, and I think he did a wonderful job. As a child, I thought he was a mean old man, because my property, our property, abutted his place down there on Water Street. And because there was a fence between us, and he didn't like it if our children went over to play in that area. We were very careful, though. We never destroyed a thing. But one winter day, I remember clearly that Janet Knight, who lived up the street from me, we planned, knowing there was a big storm coming, that we would get up early in the morning and go play there, because he had a little shed-like, and we knew we could have fun with that. So while all our parents were sleeping, we got out, we went over our fence, over into his place, where the shed was, and the snow was so high, you could climb up to the roof. And we had a great time jumping into the snow. When I got back, my mother was so angry. She wasn't angry because I had gone over into Joe Hale's place. She was angry that I wasn't there to shovel the snow on the sidewalk. Now, you were supposed to shovel your snow, you know. I mean, today they don't seem to enforce it, but in those days you had to shovel it. I was 8 years old, but I was expected to shovel that sidewalk. I don't see too many 8-year-olds out there shoveling snow today. And that always rather amused me. And then one day I always remember, because actually it was more than one day, and my friends had gone off to school, and I was kind of alone. But there were 2 little boys in the neighborhood who were 4 years old. And we decided to do a little investigating. And on Marlborough Street, right behind Joe Hale's house, because that white house on the corner was where Joe Hale lived, next is a big Federalist that's still there. And there was a barn next to it that is still there. So one day we decided to go investigate. We pushed open the door and it was open. So we went in, there were a pile of boxes there. And we systematically sat down and started emptying some of the boxes. And we had little tea parties. There were mostly dishes and things like that. But when we were through, we very carefully put everything back in the box and just walked out the door. And this went on for several days. Nobody knew we were going in there to play. And one day a neighbor caught us and told the owner. So we were chastised, you know, for going into somebody else's property. And the little boys' mothers weren't happy. And my mother wasn't very happy. Today, the parents would probably be arrested for child abuse because they didn't know where the children were. That's a big difference from today.
Yeah.
It really is.
You know, Jimmy Maguire told me the exact same story.
Did he?
Yeah. Was he the little boy?
I don't think he was, no.
Because he said something about a tea party and they put everything in Tico's back together and they kept on doing it.
Yeah.
And he said I forget who he said he went with, but
I know the names of the two boys. One was Estabrooks, because he lived across the street from me, and the other one was Bean, B-E-A-N. I knew their last names.
okay.
But their mothers were not happy.
Huh. That's
No, it
funny
wasn't.
because Jimmy Maguire told me the same exact story.
Yeah, only it was us doing it.
That's funny.
And then I always thought it was different, that because I was considered able to do it, I walked to, once I got into school, I went to the parochial school. In the first and second grades, my sister was at the high school, and she could walk me up there to school. But after those two grades, the new high school was built, and she's up at NHS there, and I walked all the way from Purchase Street to the parochial school alone, because nobody else my age was walking up there. And that's another thing now today. Parents expect to pick their kids up if it's any distance at all. You go by the middle school, you see the cars lined up for parents picking their children up.
Yeah.
And then since I could walk to school, I could also on Saturdays go pay the bills. So my mother would have me go up, and at that time, you paid the rent every week at a lawyer's office. Oh, I would go up and pay the rent and any other errands that they wanted. And then the stores were down on Marlborough Street, and one of them was Wells' store, and that was considered the better of the two. And then the other one was the one, Mr. Cook's store. But we shopped at Wells' store. And what you did, you had a little book. I would go down there, and he would mark in the book what I had bought. And then, because you'd go several times a week. And then at Saturdays, my father would go down and pay it up. So that's how you shopped in those days.
So, so what year were you born?
1920, December 1929, so it's pretty much 1930.
So okay, so you were a kid during the Great Depression. Tell
All
me.
through.
So what was the area? Did you after you were 10, you moved to Newbury? You said.
Yeah.
So tell me about how old you when this all happened. Tell me what was going on in the area.
Okay, when by the time, that I was really old enough to understand what was going on, the Depression was on, and we had a place called Knuckers uptown, where people went who didn't have any money. Now, my father, it wasn't a big paying job, but he had a job, and he had a company car. So he had his own car, plus he had a company car. And, but there were a lot of people who didn't have any money. And Mike Tarandra always told the story of how he used to go there and you could get food and you could get clothing. But the food wasn't always there. Shipments would come in. They might get a shipment of bananas, and everyone would rush down to get bananas. The staples that were usually there were things like flour. There were things like that, and beans. You could usually get those. But then on special days, something would come in, and people would rush up to get it. And what I found interesting was some people never wanted to take charity, and they were very ashamed if they had to go. Other people took it with, okay, this is it. And we had a woman in the neighborhood, if, for instance, eggs came in, she would just make egg salad sandwiches for her kids and go off and have a picnic. Other people didn't feel that way about it. They didn't want to take charity. Now, my father worked for Swift and Company, and we had an uncle on my mother's side who didn't have a job, and they had 4 children, and they didn't have much money at all. I mean, every once in a while I'd pick up a little job, but he didn't have any steady job. And every week my father would pick up 5 pounds of Hamburg at Swift's. Tell him that they had some extra on hand and leave it there. And years later, one of my cousins told me, he said, that's all the meat we had for the week for a family of 4 children and 2 adults was that 5 pounds of Hamburg. But he knew deep down my father was buying it. But he didn't let it know. I mean, in other words, he had his pride. And this looked as though it was just a gift from the store.
Yeah.
That always impressed me, that people were very good. Mm-hmm. But if you had to go to Knuckers, there was a certain shame to that. And later, when I moved to Newbury, the place, which usually you call it, is a commissary, it was at the town hall. And I was going home with some of my friends, walking home with friends from Newbury, and one of the families was one that thought nothing of it. He said, oh, let's stop in here so I can get, he wanted some jeans. And they had jeans there for him. And my mother was so upset that I went into that commissary. She said, people will think we need to go. And we didn't have much money, but we could get by without going to the commissary. So people's attitude was very different.
So what did people do? What did people do for if the what was the dynamic in say downtown Newburyport compared to Newbury? Where people working on farms, like what was happening?
Yeah, Newbury's very, very agricultural, and so that's what they had basically. There is a very big difference between Newbury and Newburyport. And you have to live in both places to understand. Newbury does not like change. Newbury stops any change that they can possibly do. Newburyport, on the other hand, that's why they separated to begin with. Newburyport wanted, people living in the waterfront district there wanted a new city hall. And Newbury didn't want it. So that's one of the reasons why they first separated. And it's the same today. It really is. I attended a meeting last week about a speech given by the talk given by the Moats family, and they were talking about what it was like in Newburyport, and it was different in Newbury. So that's why there was an area in Newbury during the war when you could have a big farm there, and that's when this company called Suffolk Farms, who was stationed in Revere, came to Newbury, and they were doing spinach, and that's what they were growing, and so it was different in that these kids from Boston came, and a lot of these were kids who had been in the name of the Truant homes, but they had been in a form of jail before. They were different. They were street kids. They were kids who knew their way around that way, and so taking that element into Newbury made some changes. But if they fit in, I mean, it fit in and all, but it was a different thing for Newbury to have that kind of people down there.
And
These are city people.
That's at the current Spencer Pierce Little Farm.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and all that area going right down to the airport was all spinach. And it was a wonderful time, though, because they would pick everybody up from the 3 roads on a flatbed, and they would bring all the people down. Obviously, I'm going to walk down because I lived right over on Graham Avenue. And so those of us who lived down here didn't have to get a ride, obviously. But what it was is you would cut the spinach, and then you would have a big bushel basket, and you would put it in, and when it got to about a third high, you would call for ice. And some of the boys were the ice people, and they came and would put ice in. And then you'd put it up another level and get ice again, until finally you got the top level. And then they weighed it, and your ticket was punched for how much it weighed. Because later you're going to get paid on basis of those punches that you have. So, and it paid pretty well. You got paid on Saturday. You could go down and you could, get your pay. So for that time, it was not bad, the pay. And you worked, if you're in the summer, you worked 5 days a week plus Saturdays till noon. And then right there, that's the same house where Noyes had the ice cream place. So you would get your pay, and very often that was a time to get a nice break and have a nice Sunday at Noyce's. But it was very congenial. You met a lot of people from all over that you wouldn't obviously have met. The North End didn't particularly mix with the South End.
That's what I've heard, yeah.
But when you put them together in that area, it was great. And another story I remember about it is this young man who drove a tractor. And he wanted to join the service because he knew that after the war there were going to be benefits for having been, working as a veteran. If he came back as a veteran, it was going to be. He couldn't get it. He couldn't go in the service because they needed him on the farm. And he really was very disappointed with that. And the other thing that happened while I was, working on the farm down there was the fire in Boston, where where it was, but anyway, many people died. And the man who drove the tractor. His sister died in that big fire, and he wore a black band. He was Italian, and this is what those people did. They would wear a black band for a whole year. So you were introduced to cultural aspects you wouldn't have ordinarily if you just lived in Newbury.
Sure. Can you tell me about Simmons Beach?
Oh, Simmons
And
Beach.
tell me about Simmons Beach, and then I want you to tell me about your beauty contest.
Oh, Simmons was a councillor from Ward 1. And remember now, Ward 1 was considered the poorest ward in the city.
And where is Ward 1? Where was that?
Right down Union Street, all that area down there, Marlborough, Lower Marlborough,
Okay.
going all the way up to, most people say it ended up at Bromfield Street. Some other people would say it went as far as Lime Street. So Lime Street right down to the end.
Okay.
And that was considered the low level. Now the street, Purchase Street, was not that different from what it is today. With the exception of a few buildings that are gone and one that's been changed, those are the same houses you see today that we thought at the time weren't that much. That wasn't considered a nice place to live. But you go down to Purchase Street now, and what you see is what it was like then. And the house I lived in was one of the few that was added to. And the house on the corner of Madison Street was a chapel. And that's interesting because it's the minister of the Unitarian Church that decided these people down there should have a church. And he knew they weren't going up to the Unitarian Church on Pleasant Street. So they made the chapel for them. And they didn't have anyone to teach the Sunday school. But Mrs. Saywood, who belonged to the Methodist Church, was nice enough to come over and teach the Bible classes to those students. I thought that was an interesting thing that she filled in for that. And the minister would come down and, you know, to see what was going on and everything. And he's kind of a special person in Newburyport. He was a very tall man, wore a big high hat and a cane, and very much in with all the elite of Newburyport, the high street people. But he would come down and check on it, and if we're playing around, he'd smile at us and everything. We thought he was very special. But those kids who went to that chapel did not go up to the, they wouldn't have thought that was their place. Lived on the upper part of Purchase Street, and when I interviewed him, one of the things that he said was, I never went up onto High Street. I knew my place.
Wow.
And they felt that that's where they belonged. Now, for all the stories you hear about how rough it was, that was if people from the North End came down to the South End, and the South Enders thought they had to assert themselves, and there would be fights. But it was always the boys.
Yeah.
Girls were never involved in anything like that.
So now Simmons
Beach, Simmons was the counselor at that time, and he decided he wanted to do something for the poor people down there. And so every summer, there were special days, but there were several days in the week, and they had this party like. Well, they had things for the boys that took place up on what is now Beacon Street in Newburyport, and that's where the baseball field was. That's all they had, either that or Cashman Park, you know. And so that they would have games for them and prizes and everything for the teams. And then everyone would go down and go swimming. And I think I have a picture in the book of the kids in swimming at Simmons Beach. He had sand brought in, and it was a pretty good beach. So we would all go down there swimming and all. And then they would have like an ice cream cart, and everybody got fresh, you know, nice ice creams and everything. And then they had the beauty contest. And one was for the upper teenage girls, and the other was for children. Now, my sisters were supposed to be taking care of me because my mother played bridge every Wednesday afternoon, so that's what I know what day it was. And my sister wasn't too happy over dragging me along to this party. I was in the same grubby little sunsuit I had been wearing all day, which wasn't particularly clean, and she drags me down there. Now, obviously, the judges at the contest thought I must have been the poorest of the poor, the way I was dressed. And so they gave me the prize for Miss Simmons Beach. And I have a picture of it. out in my yard with the big banner across Miss Something's Beach. We still have the banner. My daughter does, one of my daughters. And every time my daughter thought I was getting out of line or anything, she threatened to bring that picture to the high school where I taught and show all the kids what I looked like when I was about 4 years old. The picture was terrible. It was squinty, plump looking, and not a picture you'd want anyone to see. So she haunted me with that picture for a long time.
That's funny. Now let's talk about World War II. Tell me a little bit about what happened during World War II around here.
Well, everyone remembers what they were doing when the news came over that we were finally involved in the war. But you have to remember that the war started in Europe in 1939, and we didn't get in there till the end of 41. So the war had already been on. So the repercussions have already affected Newburyport. For instance, by 1939 at least, the Portsmouth Navy Yard is opening up, and they're building submarines and things like that to get ready for the war effort. So we were affected by it then. And, but when it actually came, I happened to be playing jacksticks, I guess it is, on the floor of my living room floor with a bunch of other girls. That's what we were doing. And I always regretted the fact that other people were doing much better things, like listening to the symphony or something. I'm afraid we weren't doing anything quite that nice. We were just playing. But it affected everybody immediately. And what I remember too about the war is in the years leading up to it, in like say 38 and 39 and everything, before we got in it, my sister, who was 8 years older, used to have a lot of friends over on the porch. My father was very outgoing. He welcomed all these young people over. And the songs that were being played at that time were all about the South Pacific. And, you know, Dorothy Lamour was the big star and everything like that. And everybody wanted to go to the South Pacific. Well, some of these same guys who were on that porch ended up in the Pacific. And one in particular, the husband of one of my sister's friends, died there. And he is buried in, on the Big Island and in the cemetery there. So they did, what they found was not exactly what they thought they were going to find.
Yeah.
Now, there's a big division, because when I interviewed people for my book, I found that one of the questions, or I had the students do a lot of the interviews, I said, find out what part of the service they chose to go in and why. And very often people, because they associated Newburyport with the water, took the Navy. But there were plenty of, if you got drafted, you got put in the Army. That was the whole difference there. And a lot of people didn't want to go in the Army particularly, so they signed up first and went in the Navy. Mm-hmm. And so we had people in the theater, European theater, and the Pacific theater. And there's a big difference there in the way the war was fought and everything. Huh. So, but it was the war years were different. I mean, number one, you had rationing from the very beginning. It isn't like the other wars sometimes, Vietnam and all, where they tell people, keep on buying and everything. You know, you couldn't buy things. You couldn't, for instance, buy a car. All cars stopped at that point, and everything that was built for the service. So if you had your car broke down or something, you had to go to the junkyard, and you had to find, and nothing was computerized. You're going to walk all around the junkyard till you find the car that's got something that maybe you could use and get a piece to do it. And that went on for at least 4 years. Huh. So it's a big difference when you can't buy a car. Yeah. But it wasn't just that. Everything you could think of, you couldn't buy, like irons and coolers and all things like that. They were no longer available to you. So there was a big shortage of things. And now, excuse me, all the men are going into different jobs. Like my father, who used to work as a salesman for Swift & Company, there's no need for them to be having salesmen to sell meat. There's not enough meat, you know, so he took a job at the Portsmouth Navy Yard as a rigger. And that meant that you had to work, not the worst shift, but you might have to work the 3 to 11 shift. And my mother wasn't used to that. You know, she didn't want to be alone at night or anything. So I ended up being told that I had to be in by 8 o'clock, which didn't make me very happy during that time. Didn't last too long. I finally wore it down. But
That's hard.
yeah, no, it was, life changed completely. So the women who are that age, you know, say 18 and above and everything, 17 and above really, didn't have a lot of men around. And if you were a man and you weren't in the service, you were looked down on. Because remember, when these people came home on leave from the service, they wore their uniforms. And if you weren't a man in uniform, you were thought to be a draft dodger, which wasn't really true, because I knew that from working at the farm. Some people who wanted to go in the service couldn't. Now, and gradually, as the war went on, the more and more men had to leave. They were finally being drafted up to the age of 35. See, at first they just would draft the younger ones, and then as it went on, and I was working at Lincoln's at the time, which was right on Pleasant Street there, a big department store, and they had one man left. And he got to be 35, and he was the one who did the windows and all the climbing and everything, and he got taken. So they had to make adjustments then. And then I interviewed one woman who was just absolutely great to interview, and she had a job at Fowles, and all of a sudden they took the butcher, and they didn't have anyone to carve up the meat and everything. So she was in charge. She didn't have the slightest idea what to do with this big piece of beef that comes in. So before he left, he showed her, put markings on it, how you would cut it. And she had to learn very carefully how to handle all that meat. And then she got certified in a few other things, but she was a real worker. So women took the job. One of my friends took a job, she was older, took a job at Atkinson's. The men were gone, and she'd be in the office down there working. So it was a whole change. And of course, there was so much that you couldn't buy. So you really could save money. I mean, everybody bought saving stamps and everything like that. You didn't have much to spend your money on. And if you tried to buy something like a pocketbook, there was a huge tax on it. Any luxury item that you didn't have to have, there was a huge tax on it. And then, of course, you couldn't go just to the store and buy meat. You had to wait in a long line. And if you were a kid like I was, they kind of brush over you, take the adults, you know, and you're trying to buy what you need. And then you had stamps, food stamps, like, and depending on the size of your family. And one of my friends came from a large family, and so they got quite a few stamps, and she was babysitting. And when the woman came back, she said to her, for whom she was babysitting, she said, don't go looking for the stamps, she said. I know you have a large family, and I needed stamps. So she took the stamps and for herself. I mean, that's how desperate people were. Wow. So if you were, you know, just a husband and wife, you didn't get too much. And you couldn't go far, because you couldn't buy tires. The only ones who could get the tires were the people who were driving to the Navy Yard and taking like 4 people with them, 4 or 5 people with them. Then they got that, and they got the extra gas. You only got enough gas practically to go to church on Sunday and a few things like that. Whereas before, you used to go to the White Mountains and places like that. My family used to have a lot of nice trips. You couldn't do that anymore. And that was very difficult. And then, of course, it hurt all the resorts,
I'm sure.
you know, where people couldn't come anymore because they couldn't get there. So the trains were running, though. You could get into Boston. That was still good. So it was a very difficult time for some people, I would say. And yet we got through the war and won it and everything.
That's
but,
cool.
Yeah.
So you want to talk about maybe we'll go. So you remember a lot about the World War II and stuff.
Oh, a lot.
And then there was the Korean and the Vietnam War, which weren't as popular wars, right?
No, and I interviewed people about the Korean War, which was very interesting. I got some good interviews with people. But by then, see, when I got married at 18, I had my first child at 20, and my 7th when I was 32. So the 50s to me were just a long round of having been taking care of many children. But I always wanted to go to college. So finally, in the 60s, I got to go to Merrimack College. And so that was a big change in my life. And I became a teacher, and I taught at the high school.
Where, at Newburyport High School?
At Newburyport High School for 30 years.
What did you teach?
International relations and American history, mostly.
Oh.
Anything to do with history.
Yeah, I love history. If I was a teacher, that's what I'd want to do.
Yeah, but it was great because I convinced the superintendent to put in the course on international relations, and I could do with it what I wanted.
That's awesome.
No one had to tell me what I could do.
That's so cool.
Today it's not like
No.
that. And from the very beginning, I always interwove local history into it,
That's
no
awesome.
matter what I was doing. If we're doing the Revolutionary War, I can get going on what's going in Newburyport and sign papers on it, look up and see what was happening here and different things like that.
Huh.
And so that helped.
So 60s. So do you remember when JFK got killed?
Oh yes, very much so.
What were you doing? What was that?
I was cleaning my house. I'm vacuuming in the living room, I can remember. And so I heard it when it first came on. And then the kids came home from school, and I sent one of my oldest boys up the hill to Mr. McWilliams. I said, make sure that Mac knows what's happening. So Jimmy runs up the hill there, and he didn't believe him at first. He said, Kennedy's dead. He said, you're crazy. But then he put the TV on. So you didn't leave the TV after that. We just sat there and watched that TV of everything that went on, including the funeral and everything like that. And my husband worked for the Kennedy campaign before he became president, when he was running, as a senator there. So my first husband was very involved in politics. He was a counselor afterwards and everything. So we had a lot of people in and out of the house.
Yeah, I'm sure.
The family was very used to political discussions and arguments and everything like that when you have a large family like that. Mm-hmm. But anyway, to get back to the Korean War, so this war is over. The man next door to us had fought, in the World War II. He was an electrician, and he got called back. He had just started his business in Newburyport, and he got called back in the service again because they couldn't wait. They had to get the people they needed right away, and people like him got called in. After about a year or so, they let him out again. But he never went back to owning a business. It was just so discouraging for him.
I'm sure.
That happened to quite a few people. So the Korean War was different because there just wasn't that much enthusiasm. We were defending something over there, where with Pearl Harbor we were defending ourselves.
Yeah.
And it made a difference. Mm-hmm. So when I tried to find people who had actually served in it, I found a lot of people who served but didn't do the actual fighting in it.
Yeah.
But I had corresponded with a fellow from Newburyport, and his mother wrote pieces for the paper. And I remember this was when the Korean War just started. They didn't have the right uniforms or anything. It's cold in Korea in the winter.
Yeah.
And she was saying how much they needed, uniforms and things like that. And so I kept in touch with some people during the war, the Korean War. And then I always remembered the fact that the McWilliams family, their son had been at Harvard, and one of the fellows from Harvard had lived with him for a while. He was a Korean. And he went back at that time. They never heard from him again.
Huh.
Yeah, so that was sort of interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then of course by Vietnam, one of my own sons went to Vietnam. And that was quite a crisis because my oldest son wouldn't have gone if called. He felt this was not a good war, that we would be spending our money on our own infrastructure, which we should have since it's fallen apart today. Yeah. And the second son, who's only 17 months younger, feels as though this is wrong, you should support your government. So he leaves high school to go to the war in Vietnam. So we had some very interesting discussions.
I'm sure.
And I did a table with my trying to be neutral, although frankly, I did agree with the oldest one that it wasn't our war. But and we lost a lot of people
Yeah.
in that war. But the second son did join the Marines, and he did serve in Vietnam, and he saw a lot of fighting and everything.
Sure.
So, but when he came back, he didn't want. He said, "I'm out. It's over. I don't want to talk about it." So he wouldn't talk about it. So, but if anybody said anything, he didn't approve of all these people who were, complaining about everything. He said, "You served. It's over. Get on with your life." But if anyone else said anything disparaging about it, he would knock them down, you know. But he himself felt it was time to move on. So I went through that war. And then the Gulf War, I knew,
Yeah.
people. So I followed all the wars, obviously.
Now I just want to talk to you about, growing up, times have changed. Everything's so much different, and, what's your outlook on life, kind of? Like what changes, getting older and seeing the area change? And
Well, what you can see with me, that when these men came back from war, they wanted to get on with their lives. They wanted to raise families. The 50s were a different era, and that's all they wanted to do. And it was very normal for all of us young people to get married young then. That wasn't unusual, and to have very large families. That the Kelly family, the Clancy family, all these people had big families. But I think most of the people who had big families were all Irish Catholics, because there was a ruling against birth control. That the other groups didn't, because you wouldn't find large families in the Jewish population or the Armenians. They would have children, but they didn't have a lot of children. I found that was a big difference in it. And then when the pill came, that kind of changed things. And then you didn't see as many large families as you do now. So as far as society goes, that was a big change, I would say. But, you made do with what you had. I just think I didn't think of them as particularly as very hard years then, although I was only one of two children. My sibling was 8 years older than I was. I was almost like an only child. So for me, suddenly, to have all this large family was a big difference for me. But I always had a lot of energy at that time, so, I got through it and everything. Then I decided to go to college, and I got into Merrimack, and I had a wonderful time there because I went days, and most older people went nights. And so all my classes were with the young kids. And it was so funny. I'll never forget it. The girls all called me Mrs. Foley, but the boys called me Jean. And they all wanted me to go to their happy days after school when they all get together and have a few drinks and everything. I said, I got to get home. I got to feed 8 people tonight, I can't be doing all of this. So, and then one day, because I had been home with just children. I did a lot of reading, so that part I was up on and everything. But I felt rather intimidated having lunch with all these young people. So I took my brown bag and ate it in the car. Well, it was getting cold. November was coming. I'm out there in the car eating my lunch, and one of the people in my class, a young man, came by. "What are you doing out here?" I said, "It's just too intimidating for me to go in." And he said, "You come right in with me. You sit at our table. You're not going to sit in the car." I never forgot his kindness.
Yeah.
He decided to take me in.
Cool.
Yeah, so they were. Last summer, I was able to be reunited with some of these girls in my class, and we got together last summer.
That's cool.
And now they're retired. It's a whole different thing.
So I understand you've been recognized in the area for the work you've done.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you, and why have you done writing books? Why do you do this?
Well, I didn't start out to do it. I started at a committee at the Historical Society. I was on the board, and I said, we've got a lot of history about the 1600s, 1700s. You don't have anything in the 20th century. And I looked up the mission statement, and the mission statement for the Historical Society was to record history. That was the first item. Nothing had been done about World War II. And now the whole 20th century, they thought it was too soon. And I said, if we don't do it now, we're not going to have the information, because other people have written at the time when it was happening. We got to do that. So, okay, they finally said, go ahead, and formed a committee and everything. But it's not easy working with a committee. Not everybody shares your enthusiasm for it. And a lot of people just decided they would do just a little piece. Well, finally, for various reasons, it got to the point where I figured I'd better go off on my own. So I did because I was doing a chronology. And so I did the chronology of the first 50 years. And it was very well received. I'm not a writer. I've tried to tell people that. I recorded. In other words, I'm not painting the big picture for you. I am telling you what happened. You decide what you think about it, you know?
Yeah.
If you got the facts, okay, well, how do you feel about it? So,
That's cool.
and so that's how I got going on actually writing book one. And it was very much helped by a man named Ron Irving, who had done a lot of research. And I found out just by chance what he had done. And he was able to use a lot of his material, and I gave him credit for it. He did it. We have a resource in that library with what he did that no other community around has. And he had just spent years doing research, but he was a very quiet, reserved man, and not too many people knew about it. So that's a big source in that library. And I liked fitting it in the history with my classes. Like, even if I was doing international relations, I could use Caleb Cushing when he was our envoy to China and fit all that in. This is how Newburyport played a part in what happened there. And everything I could do that affected us in that, I fit in. So then in the 1995 era, I had the kids do a lot of interviewing at times. And you got some great stories, you know, about real stories about the lives that their parents or grandparents lived. And so we were having so much luck with that, we decided to publish book pamphlets. So we published 3 different pamphlets. 2 of them were mostly on the Great Depression, and then the 3rd one was on World War II. And that's the only source we have of all those men. I mean, we didn't get every man, but we got a lot of people. And that's the only source in Newburyport that you have of what they did, why they went, where they went, and what they did. And one of the questions we asked those who were in the Pacific Theater was, how do you feel about the atomic bomb? And every single one of the men said that it was justified. Now, right after that, there was a lot of turmoil in the United States about whether we should have used it or not. All of those men said, including Ed Molin, who was one of our mayors. And he said the most ridiculous thing was what he was doing in the service. He was much more qualified for what he was doing at home because he was a master die maker. And he would have had a deferment in his job. The secretary forgot to put the deferment in, so he got taken into the drafted. And he said, my job when we were to take over Japan was to, have this pamphlet with me, a pad of paper, and take notes on what we were doing. And he said it was so ridiculous. And he was at, not Iwo Jima, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. I mean, he was in big battles. He saw some fighting. But he always felt that he was worth more at home with what he was doing than he did there. And then we had heroes like Bob Fuller. Have you heard about Bob Fuller?
No.
Oh, God. He was a character. And we interviewed him for the pamphlets and everything else. And he told it as it was. He was very little money or anything, and he was always, snitching things here and there,
Yeah.
And finally he had done so much of that he was getting caught, and he decided maybe he'd better take a ride across the country. So he starts thumbing across the country, and he ends up out west someplace, and once again he gets in trouble for shoplifting. And he goes before the judge, and the judge says, you got 2 choices. You can go to jail, or you can join the Marines. So that's how he joined the Marines. And he's funny. He tells everything that he did and everything.
So
and in the end, he was the highest ranked veteran that we had. He got not the highest medal, but the second highest. The reason he didn't get the highest medal was the fact that he was in the brig so much, because he was always drinking. And
That's funny.
so and then he wrote a book about it. That book is in the library. It's about his service, and he went on to do some very good things, and charitable things and everything, I think in the Latin America area.
Nice.
So he's quite a guy. He's got quite a background.
Cool.
He's gone now,
Yeah.
but my husband knew him quite well. So we knew Bob Fuller. So there were so many stories like that.
Sure.
And my second husband, well, see if you turn around there, you'll see he's holding a picture of the ship that he was in charge of during the war. And this was one of the ones where you have a small boat, and you take so many people. And he was in 5 invasions, and that's a lot.
Yeah.
And the last one was D-Day, Day 1.
Wow.
So he was in
He was
that.
there?
He was
That's
there.
crazy.
And you could see it, he said, in a lot of the pictures they took, because the boat behind them, or in front of them, was the one that was taking the pictures of that whole armada that was in front of them. And you could see his was number 8, landing craft.
Wow.
So you landed the men on D-Day, but you couldn't leave then, because by then the tide was going to be changing. So you're a sitting duck until you could get out of there. What they would do, they took the wounded back to England. Then they came back the next day and did the same thing. So he had heavy service in World War II.
Wow.
That's my first husband, on the other hand, was only 17 when he joined the service. And this was probably around February, I think, of 45. No one knew the war was going to be over. You got to remember that about it. Even the vice president didn't know they had the bomb. So as far as you know, when you joined up then, which you wondered why youth would ever join up for, is that there was going to be a lot of killing. So he was going under the Golden Gate Bridge on his 17th birthday, because you could join up early, but you couldn't go out of the country. So once he was under the bridge, and he was 17, it was legal for him to go on to the Philippines.
Wow.
So I had one doing that kind of service and one being in from the very beginning. But my second husband said he signed up, not because he was so patriotic, but because he didn't want to go in the army. And he figured the Navy was a better choice.
Yeah.
He didn't pretend to be any great hero or anything, but he saw more service than most people I know.
That's crazy. There's a movie, Saving Private Ryan,
Oh yeah.
and that's amazing. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't even. I'm sure it was way worse than that movie portrays.
Oh yeah. I mean, he one time the moon was out here, and he was saying, well, it's not so great when you're over in the Mediterranean and the moon is out, because you are a sitting duck for all those planes, the Nazi planes and everything.
Wow.
So the year, not the year they celebrated the 50th anniversary, but the year after, we went over and redid what he did in the whole
been
thing.
Amazing.
Oh yeah, to see the exact spot where he landed and everything, or landed the troops. But it was, so I'm very used to World War II, let's say, from 2 ways.
Yeah.
My own son from Vietnam, and my husband from the Pacific, and Joe from the European section. So it was very different. There will never be a time like it again. You will never see that many ships out there. That's something that will never return after that. They did away with that way of fighting a great deal, So it's just different situation today. On what I did with the thing, that was what I got an award for from the state and national organization for local history. It was for the fact I had been doing it all my life, all my teaching years. It isn't for doing a book. It was for the way I used it in my teaching and the 2 books. And it continues afterwards. I still get requests from people, which I think is fascinating. I got one request, this is an interesting story. This man emailed me and said he had been trying to get information about Rupert Knox's father, who was a designer at Doyle. he was interested in toll silver, so he was interested in that. And he had been given my name. And I didn't know, I figured it was someone my age, retired person, that this was just a hobby for them. And I knew I had had material, but I had had a serious accident. A lot of my material was down cellar. I had to get my daughter to get down to pick it up. So I knew I had done research on it. I've done a lot of research that hasn't been published because I was just doing this. And so I sent him what I had. And which was more than he had. He didn't have anything because when toll was sold, the people didn't care about the history. They wanted the patents. And there's only a few natives that saved some things, so in the family. So I decided, well, I don't know, Rupert Knock was dead then, but I knew he had a son over in Salisbury. You don't have to use this, but it's just interesting. And I knew he ran a gym over there, the Knock Gym. So I called.
Knocks, is that
yeah, what is it?
Hard Knocks? Is that?
That's probably the name
Is that
of
Amesbury?
it. I thought it was Salisbury. Could be Amesbury.
Yeah.
Anyway, I called up. I got his wife, and she said, and I introduced myself, and she said, "I know you." She said, "I used to live up the hill from you when you lived on Low Street." She mentioned her father's name, which I knew her father, knew who he was and everything. And then she got going about my gardens, because I do a lot of gardening.
Yeah.
And that took 15 minutes before I even got to get back to the subject I came on.
Jeez.
And then she had all the pictures. She had a picture of him holding the 5 patents on the silver that he had done. And then she got in touch with her sister-in-law who lived out west. Then I remembered a friend whose father was the engraver at Toll, father-in-law, and her husband was dead, but she had all those pictures. And then Glee Woodworth, because there's a lot at the cemetery, she knew where he was buried, and she sent him, a map of how to find the burial site. He was engulfed with all this material that he didn't have before. So he said to me once, he said, "Is everybody in Newburyport like this? Are they all that good?" And I said, "Well, of all the work I've done, no one's ever refused me." So I have to say it's a nice place to live.
Cool.
Because you know people. Obviously, I've lived here all my life. A year ahead of me was Byron Matthews and George Lawler were a year ahead of me in school. Sullivan was a few years behind. These are people I've known all my life. So when I went to write this book, I had it from the base up of knowing about what was going on in Newburyport. Makes it a lot easier to write if you know the people. You know who to ask. And it was very interesting. So it goes on. When people, if I can help people, I do.
So what's your what would you say to somebody that the future, what do you say to the future and history and the importance of history,
Oh, I think it's very important because the people from historic New England who were involved in this prize thing and everything said, especially like the second book, people will think, oh, well, it's too soon to write about it. It isn't. 50 years from now, people are certainly going to appreciate everything you said that was going on in the city at that time. It gives them something to work with.
Yeah.
So I think it was rewarding. I didn't do it to make money. You do not make money, believe me. It cost me money. But it was like a gift. That's my gift to the city for, the fact that I've lived here. The city and the town, because it included what went on in Newbury too, which isn't too much.